If you say that something is stupid, you are engaging in disablist language. Heck, the name of this series, Periodic Insanity, is also disablist. Seriously, that's what leftists believe. If you look at a handicapped person who manages to do extraordinary things overcoming his or her handicap, you're engaging in inspiration porn. So if you admire, let's say, Peter Longstaff's paintings, which he painted using his feet, that's inspiration porn. And it's bad, according to our moral superiors on the left. In other news, ultrasounds are a tool of the patriarchy meant to oppress women. How do our moral superiors even know that? Well, ultrasounds have this capability of introducing reality into the conversation, which subsequently convinces a plethora of mothers to rethink the issue of abortion and routinely come out on the wrong side of the progressive left. These are our stories on Periodic Insanity. Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Periodic Insanity here on Freedom Alternative. Alright, it's been over 2 months since we did an episode, not because there wasn't insanity to cover, but because I wanted to avoid 1 hour long videos, since most of the insanity in the last 2 months was so egregious that lumping 3 or 4 in one such episode would have resulted in a very long episode that no one would watch. And with that, let's see if we can get this one under 45 minutes. I don't think so, but let's try. So, the first on the agenda comes from the hub of leftist insanity, care2.org, which, as I usually say, is a very scary place where I go in so you don't have to. So, 40 alternatives to these ableist and oppressive words. And goes like this, quote, "You may have overheard people discussing ableist or disablist language lately." Well, actually, no, I haven't, because I don't live in a world where unhinged cretins represent more than 0.0002% of the populace. Oh, was that disablist? Anyway. Many disability rights activists are pushing people to change the way they talk to fight disability stigma, a form of discrimination aimed at disabled people or people with disabilities for fans of person-first language. Wait, what? I can't take this seriously. The fans of person-first language? No, I told you that this is a very dark place. Back to the article. Imagine if a term associated with your identity was considered an insult. It would sting, right? And every time people used it, they would be reinforcing the idea that people like you are bad and unwanted. Now, stop right there. You see, this is a thing with the modern left. They're now into the business of justifying their totalitarian instinct on protecting feelings. And this is important to remember, because I'll soon make another video in which I'll show you what the leftists are discussing to address their ideological crisis as society starts shifting towards free speech and against social justice. The proper answer to this is swift dismissal and outright meanness. Now, I know this is hard for conservatives. Conservatives try to get along and try to avoid being unnecessarily mean. But this is a case where it is absolutely necessary to be as mean as you can be. So, imagine there is a term associated with your identity used as an insult shtick. I usually answer with something like this. Well, I don't have to imagine. There already are insults associated with my identities. White male being one of them, made an insult by the left. Satanist is another one, because I'm a metalhead. There is also one that doesn't actually exist in English, aimed at poking fun at people wearing glasses. In Romanian, those wearing glasses can be called the four-eyed stove. It's nowhere near as fun in English, though. And the shortened four-eyed that I've seen used sometimes in English is basically way too tame to even be considered an insult. Now, do you know what I do with them? I laugh along if they're funny or brush them off if they're not. That's called being an adult. Just because you have a handicap, such as me having an imperfect sight, doesn't mean I get to be a child about it and bitch and complain and try to police other people's language and thoughts. That's ridiculous. The point is to knock off the falsely assumed sense of moral superiority of the lefty right off the bat. The purpose of language is to make yourself understood, not to protect feelings, you muppets. Anyway, let's read some more preaching. Quote, "Many of these words and phrases are so ingrained in society that you might not consciously realize they're associated with disability. In some cases, these terms were recently on the books of state and federal code in the United States. Here are some examples of ableist language: retarded, lame, crippled, crazy, insane, dumb, feeble-minded, moronic, spaz, psycho, schizo, maniac, idiot, cretin, loony, hysterical, gimp, nuts, wheelchair-bound, freak, weak, invalid as a noun, and special. Some of these terms were used even they need an editor for sure. Some of these words were used even diagnostically in the past. I guess they wanted to say like moron, dumb, and retarded. Now, is it me, or this seems to be a list of adjectives impeccably describing the left, and then on top of it some extremely and perfectly commonsensical words and expressions? I mean, come on, what's wrong with wheelchair-bound? It's a very short, on-point description of someone who's suffering from paralysis and is, well, wheelchair-bound. Also, what's wrong with hysterical? Feminists are always hysterical about utterly nonsensical issues. That's a perfectly legitimate description of virtually all feminists. There's nothing disablist in this, just plain language. Well, unless you consider feminism to be a mental disorder, which I kinda do. But it gets worse. Now just listen how they justify this perpetual newspeak. Quote, "It is important to note that some disabled people choose to use these terms to refer to themselves, arguing that reclaiming insults can dilute their power, but unless someone invites you to use them, they're best to be avoided. Other terms that continue to be used diagnostically can turn into slurs when individuals use them to refer to something bad, like OCD, bipolar, schizophrenic, autistic, disabled, or mentally ill. Other phrases like handicapped, special needs, suffers from, victims of, and differently abled are starting to fall out of favor. Some people view them as slurs, and perhaps in a decade, they'll join the list of words and phrases considered inappropriate when referring to disability. Well, fuck you very much. I'll speak however I damn please." Back to the article. "It can be very hard to eradicate words from daily use when they're such a ubiquitous part of how you talk. So we've rounded up some suggested alternatives for a variety of situations. The cool thing about fighting disablist language is that you get to expand your vocabulary and communicate better, conveying precisely what you mean." So, it's cool to censor people and bring about newspeak. And then the left wonders why it's losing youngsters much faster than ever before. Here's a hint for you, free hint for lefties. Young people don't think something is cool just because you say so. It actually has to be cool. And censorship, well, censorship ain't cool, darling. Alright, let's take a look at their list. If you mean frustrating or perplexing, this is so stupid, or this is retarded, or that's retarded, consider frustrating, pointless, annoying, irritating, or obnoxious. Okay, so what if I think this effort is retarded? If you mean intense, as in whoa, crazy, consider this: intense, awesome, amazing, wild, or fascinating. That's fascinating. The level of irritating, obnoxious wildness in this article is frustrating. Now, did I do that right? They're beyond comedy. let's see some more. If you mean bad or unpleasant, as in whoa, that's lame, consider this: bad, awful, uncool, gross, or the pits. The pits? It gets worse. If you mean it as an intensifier, positive or negative, as in she's a crazy good artist or this is insanely difficult, consider really, very, intensely, wicked, or considerably. Wicked? I mean, how on earth is wicked synonymous with intensely? I mean, I'm not a native English speaker, but to me, insanely difficult, for instance, and wickedly difficult are simply not the same thing. But hey, what do I know? I'm not trying to fight disablist language. If you mean unreasonable or absurd, as in that's crazy, consider using unreasonable, absurd, outrageous, unacceptable, or ridiculous. Again, these aren't always acceptable synonymous. I mean, believing that the wage gap is real is unreasonable and ridiculous. Believing Caitlyn Jenner is a woman is biology denying top tier crazy. Not everything that's unreasonable is necessarily crazy. I mean, come on, even I know that, and English is my third language. But it gets even worse. If you mean to describe someone with a bad, dangerous character, as in she's psychotic or he's a sociopath, consider using dangerous, menacing, threatening, evil, or murderous. Again, not everyone that is a sociopath is necessarily murderous, evil, threatening, or dangerous. In fact, most murderers aren't sociopaths nor psychopaths. The best career for a psychopath is neurosurgery. I'm not joking. Look it up. Same goes with psychotic. I mean, someone being psychotic doesn't necessarily mean one is dangerous, menacing, threatening, evil, or murderous. Now, unless you think risking breaking a glass is threatening. Anyway, it gets even worse. If you mean to describe someone who's doing something a little dorky, as in they're such a spaz or are you retarded or something, consider using silly, dorky, cheesy, nonsensical, or illogical. Alright, I think this one doesn't really exist. I mean, dorks are usually called autistic because most dorks tend to be autistic. But spaz or retarded? Not so much. If you mean to describe something that's difficult to understand or totally bizarre, as in these mass shootings are just crazy, consider using fathomless, daunting, overwhelming, bizarre, or bottomless. Fathomless. Right. Because in an emotional moment, when someone's saying that these mass shootings are crazy, one will surely pause to come up with words like fathomless or overwhelming. And this comes from a rag that otherwise says you're privileged if you can use complicated words. The bottom line on this story is this: you don't get to dictate how I speak. And if you meet a person that pulls these kinds of stunts, do the Jordan Peterson thing and refuse to abide by it and shove it in his or her face. Defiance is what scares them the most. And I say we give them tons of it because these fathomless schmucks absolutely do deserve it. Alright, let's go to the second story, also from Care 2. What is inspiration porn? Seriously, this one is legitimately crazy. I mean, it's not only about telling healthy people what they should and shouldn't watch and what they should and shouldn't feel inspired by, because we all know that the left is the feelings police, but also what handicapped folks should and shouldn't do. Heaven forbid they inspire some healthy person out there and thus creating inspiration porn, which is a recently made up term that not even the inhabitants of the Care 2's ecosystem had heard before. I mean, this is cutting edge lunacy, folks. Quote, you may have heard people slinging around the phrase inspiration porn and wondered what they mean, and no, it's not adult entertainment. The term coined by Australian disability rights activist Stella G. Young refers to a common framework that non-disabled people use to discuss disability, namely labeling disabled people and their lives as inspiring, often for no other reason than that they exist. Some disabled people argue this oppressive practice devalues their lives and experiences, reducing them to a meme. Have you ever seen a poster with a slogan like "The only disability is a bad attitude" or "Let's concentrate on abilities, not disabilities"? Being sent a link to an adorable video of a cat or dog using a wheelchair for mobility, seen and advertised designed to provoke emotion by showing disabled person using a mobility device like a prosthesis or a wheelchair? If you have, you've seen inspiration porn. Oh yeah, I forgot to let you know about this. CARE 2 is into all lunacies imaginable and unimaginable of the left. So of course they're into the animal rights lunacy, animal rights as understood by the terrorist movement Animal Liberation Front, that is. So as you can see, watching an adorable video of a kitten using a wheelchair is inspiration porn. Because heaven forbid you think the kitten is cute. Well, we can't have that. That would be disablist. Alright, let's read some more. Quote, "It may be used to suggest that non-disabled people don't have it so bad after all. There are people with real problems around them. This sort of messaging aims to encourage hard work because look at disabled people who are accomplishing things. If they can do it, so can you. If this little girl can paint by holding the brush in her mouth, what are you waiting for?" Young, a comedian and activist, wrote an essay about the phenomenon in 2012 stating, quote, "My everyday life in which I do exactly the same things as everyone else should not inspire people, and yet I'm constantly congratulated by strangers for simply existing," close quote. She noted that people with physical impairments, especially wheelchair users, are often regarded as inspiring for completing tasks like going to the grocery store alone or riding public transportation. This, Young argued, has a complicated set of results. Young pointed out that inspiration porn makes disabled people feel bad by suggesting that they should be cheerful and upbeat while overcoming their obstacles. Similarly, it suggests that those who don't feel that way are letting the community down by failing to perform disability the way people want them to. Inspiration porn can also be downright objectifying. Often, the disabled person isn't named in the media, whether a news article, video, poster, or brief anecdote on Twitter focuses on that person's disability to the exclusion of their humanity. Children are frequent objects of inspiration porn because people associate them with innocence and think of disability as suffering, so images of disabled children are meant to tug at the heartstrings of non-disabled people. Individuals with distinctive impairments, especially those who are disfigured in the eyes of non-disabled people, are also common objects of inspiration porn. Oh my god. The level of reality denying is over 9,000 in this article. I mean, disfigured has a clear meaning. It's not in the eyes of non-disabled people. Also, it's not non-disabled. Come on, healthy people. The person in the photo on the left of the screen is disfigured. The person in the photo on the right is not disfigured. You don't have to be disabled to understand this. Also, the fact that one Australian activist doesn't like something doesn't make it an objective fact. Just because she doesn't consider it inspiring to paint with your feet, that doesn't mean it isn't inspiring. I can't paint at all, for instance, so the fact that this chap can, 1, paint, and 2, do it whilst having no arms is legitimately praiseworthy. Not only he can do something that I cannot do, but he can do it whilst having to overcome an obstacle that I wouldn't need to should I ever decide to start painting, which I'll never do because I did it in the past and I'm horrible at it. Anyway, let's read some more. Quote, "An excellent example is when people are invited to stare at pictures of people who have ichthyosis. This skin condition can make someone's skin appear reddened or scaly, and it tends to attract attention. This situation is certainly uncomfortable and made more so when an individual's humanity is erased for the benefit of a cheerful PSA, implying that if someone with this skin condition can go out in public, you have nothing to worry about. There's another issue with inspiration porn. While disability doesn't automatically equate to suffering and hardship, everyone's relationship with disability is different. It can present certain challenges that non-disabled people don't experience or understand. Inspiration porn often overrides those realities, making it difficult for disabled people to speak out about the issues they face. For example, if you see a photo of a parathlete running down the track on high-tech prosthetic limbs, or two wheelchair users racing for the finish line, it could just be another picture of an athlete in peak condition, but often it comes with a sappy tagline or an inspirational note. What you don't see is that adaptive athletic gear can cost tens of thousands of dollars, and very few disabled people can afford it. In fact, many disabled people can't even afford the everyday gear they need. For instance, some individuals are trapped in bed because their wheelchairs are broken and they can't afford to repair or replace them. Now, that's not very inspiring, isn't it? No, it's not. But that doesn't make the success of those successful any less inspiring, you bloody twat. You see, this is the shtick, generally with the left. They hate everyone who is successful, who's managed to do something with and for himself. In this regard, they are indeed egalitarian. They hate successful handicapped people. They say they hate successful blacks, they hate successful gay people with the wrong politics, and they generally hate everyone who isn't a miserable whiny schmuck like they are. That's why a good synonym for leftism is the politics of envy. Normal people admire successful people and inquire on how to replicate their success. Leftists envy successful people and want to take them down to their miserable, pathetic level, in the name of equality, of course. Anyway, the reason I'm bringing these forth to you is because nonsense like this does emerge in local politics. You won't see such insanity on national stages, at least not that overtly, but you will see them in local NGOs trying to push local policy. And if you plan to follow the instructions I gave in my local activism video, you will have to be aware of such things. Radical nonsense like this is the bread and butter of most NGOs, and most of them are involved in local politics. Just saying. Alright, let's go to the third story, and probably the last. Coming from The Atlantic. How ultrasound became tyrannical. And yes, it's a piece about abortion. Now, I made a video already about abortion called 5 Reasons Why Pro-Choicers Suck, which I suggest you do watch. If you haven't done so already. Basically, I am somewhat sympathetic to pro-choicers in the sense that I don't believe abortion should generally be banned because that's not a realistic policy. With that said, I cannot stand with pro-choicers most of the time for the simple reason that pro-choicers have become insane. The militant pro-abortionists have become the anti-science party, and this particular article is another piece of evidence to the already huge pile of evidence that pro-choicers are bonkers. So this article is very long, so we'll take some excerpts from it. It goes like this, quote, "One of the first measures that Republicans in the 115th Congress proposed was the Heartbeat Protection Act. On January 11, a group led by Steve King of Iowa introduced a bill that would require doctors nationwide to check for a fetal heartbeat before performing an abortion and prohibit them from completing the procedure if they found one. In December, Republicans in the Ohio State Legislature put forth a similar measure. Governor John Kasich vetoed it, observing that such a law would almost certainly be struck down as unconstitutional, but approved a 20-week abortion ban." Now, for those who may not know, and I noticed American liberals tend to be extremely ignorant about this, a 20-week abortion ban isn't Governor Kasich being an oppressive misogynist. It's actually Kasich being extremely liberal. Sweden, for instance, has a 16-week limit, and most of Europe has limits between 12 and 14 weeks, except Poland, Malta, and Ireland, which have a 0-week limit. That is to say, abortion on demand, just because you feel like, is a no-no. I feel the need to point this out because every time a Republican tries to put a commonsensical regulation on this practice, the Democrat media complex goes berserk and cries the end of the world over it. The reality, though, is quite simple. The United States is unfathomably liberal with abortion, even by extremely liberal European standards. Democrats always beg for America to become more like Europe, yet when Republicans want to do that, they turn around and say, well, not that Europe. Speaking of which, Trump wants to cut corporate taxes to 20%. That's Denmark level, by the way. You know Denmark, the leftists' favorite leftist utopia? Well, do leftists cheer that Trump is making America more like Europe? Of course not, don't be silly. They all bitch and complain about it. Anyway, let's read a bit more. This article is really fascinating in so many regards. Quote, opponents of the heartbeat bills have pointed out that they would eliminate abortion rights almost entirely, making the procedure illegal around 4 weeks after fertilization before many women even realize that they're pregnant. These measures raise even more elementary questions. What is a fetal heartbeat, and why does it matter? The idea would have been unthinkable before the advent of a technology developed in 1976, real-time ultrasound. At 6 weeks, the heartbeat is not audible. It is visible, a flickering that takes place between 120 and 160 times per minute on a black and white playback screen. As cardiac cells develop, they begin to send electrical pulses that cause their neighbors to contract. Scientists can observe the same effect if they culture cells in a petri dish. Doctors do not even call this rapidly dividing cell mass a fetus until 9 weeks into pregnancy. Yet the current debate shows how effectively politicians have used visual technology to redefine what counts as life. Now, notice that there is a little star there, which leads to this particular note. This article originally stated that there is no heart to speak of in a 6-week-old fetus. By that point in a pregnancy, a heart has already begun to form. We regret the error. Translation. This article was even more anti-science than it is now. We don't actually regret the error, we just regret being caught lying so egregiously about science that even our side had to correct us. But anyway, moving beyond this annotation, the language used here is highly disingenuous. It's not politicians who use technology to redefine life. No, it's the science who did that. The same science which says that they found life on Mars when they find the bacteria. They also use technology there to define life. This is why pro-choicers are rapidly losing the moral debate, because they no longer sell their policy as a necessary trade-off, which it is, but rather as a moral good in itself, which it isn't. Again, there was a time when liberals were selling abortion as safe, legal, and rare, acknowledging right off the bat that it is killing, but nevertheless contended that having it legal yields better results, and is thus a pragmatic trade-off between two moral evils: the evil of sentencing poor women to raise children they can't afford, and the evil of killing the unborn. Now, regardless of your position on this issue, that line of reasoning at the very least made sense. It was a legitimate position to take. But since then, liberals have evolved from that into the moral depravity that progressivism is today. Let's read some more. Quote, since the mid-1990s, opponents of abortion have deployed ultrasounds in their attempts to restrict abortion access. 5 states have enacted informed consent laws which require doctors to show their patients ultrasound images and in some cases to describe the images before performing an abortion. 2 of those laws have been struck down by state courts. 20 other states require a doctor to at least offer to show a woman seeking an abortion ultrasound. These measures are based on 2 assumptions. First, that an ultrasound image has an obvious meaning. Second, that any pregnant woman who sees an ultrasound will recognize this meaning. Science does not bear either assumptions out. Now, is there any evidence about that? Of course not. They then move straight into the history of ultrasounds, and this is where it gets interested, because the extreme bias and utter lack of scientific knowledge of the author come into place for all to see. So, they talk about how the technology was developed during wartime, and then let's skip a bit and go straight to this portion. Quote, after the war, Army-trained scientists and Army-funded laboratories demobilized the technology, turning away from the ocean towards women's bodies. In the early 1960s, doctors in Europe, Japan, and the United States simultaneously developed and promoted the widespread use of ultrasound in clinical settings. The first international conference on diagnostic ultrasound took place in Pittsburgh in 1965. That same year, fetal images began to spread across popular culture. Now, notice the language. The technology was turned away from the ocean and towards women's bodies. Amazing. But it gets worse. Quote, on April the 30th, 1965, Life published another cover story that would become iconic. The Drama of Life Before Birth presented a series of dramatic color photographs by the Swedish photojournalist Lennart Nilsson. Annotations detailed the developmental stages of an embryo from fertilization to 28 weeks. One page showed the fetus enclosed, forehead straining against the amniotic sac. Another showed the fetus suspended in a dark void surrounded by pinpoints of light resembling stars. Nilsson called it the spaceman embryo. The following year, Nilsson published a book on embryology for expecting couples. A Child is Born. It quickly became an international bestseller. These images produced a new and unprecedented vision of human development. Before ultrasound, medical care received by pregnant women had depended on their testimony or how they described their own sensations. Ultrasound made it possible for the male doctor to evaluate the fetus without female interference. Ultrasound images carried the associations of objectivity typically according to the camera, and they conferred authority on the doctor who interpreted their contents. They seemed to give him immediate access to the tiny human floating inside his patient's body. Of course, ultrasound technology has been a crucial component of prenatal care too. Imagery obtained through ultrasound can alert doctors to potentially serious problems in a pregnancy, such as placental issues or congenital defects in the fetus. And this is why I call them the anti-science party. They really cannot help it. I mean, anything, including objective science, must be sacrificed on the altar of ideas. And if that can't be fully achieved, then at the very least it should be reframed to fit the ideology. So suddenly, doctors using this technology to save millions and millions of babies and women from what used to be a certain death sentence is now magically transformed into the male doctor evaluating the fetus without female interference. Never mind that female doctors weren't rare at all in 1965, but the pure partisan hackery of this author is noteworthy through its extremism. Mind you, this author is a doctoral candidate in comparative literature at Yale University. You know, the "we're creating a home here" Yale University. But by what we've read so far, I think it's fair to conclude that this author is a scientifically illiterate leftist bigot. But anyway, she goes on to describe some pro-life film from the 1980s that no one really cares about anymore, and then goes on to bash the existence of ultrasounds a bit more, even as she claims they have no effect. The level of doublethink throughout this article is absolutely astounding and fantastic to observe. And the reason I say that that film doesn't matter is because there are now two generations, at the very least two generations of pro-lifers who weren't even born when that movie was made. And 4 generations of pro-lifers who weren't born when Life magazine published the story she's talking about. Really, her analysis is Anita Sarkeesian tier of cultural critic. That is to say, utter nonsense. Anyway, so let's skip that particular piece of nonsense and read some more. Quote, today the kinds of photographs that stunned the readers of Life in 1966 have become commonplace. Every rom-com involving an unplanned pregnancy, from Knocked Up to Juno to Bridget Jones's Baby, seem to include an obligatory scene in which the reluctant mother is shown an ultrasound and decides to keep her child. Celebrity ultrasounds have become their own subgenre of tabloid baby bump stories. In many ways, social media have heightened the social reality of the unborn. Expecting parents post ultrasound photos on Facebook and Instagram. They go to the keepsake ultrasound chains in order to buy DVDs of 3D and 4D images, which in turn sustain an entire cottage industry on Etsy. Last year, an American couple posted a video of their sonogram fast-forwarded so that their fetus appeared to be clapping in time as they sang "When You're Happy and You Know It, Clap Your Hands." The internet debated whether or not the video was a hoax. That is, they debated whether in fact this fetus understood the lyrics of a song and responded to them on cue. Were they serious? The fantasy clearly appealed. The post was viewed on YouTube nearly 12 million times, yet it remains unclear what the popular enthusiasm for fetal images actually means. Oh, suddenly your cultural critic skills have vanished, darling? Because I'll tell you what that means. It means that more and more people take a bit of contact with science and realize there's an actual human being in there. And they share that knowledge around because they hadn't been told that in school, and what they can see with their own eyes just tends, seriously, it just tends to have a much more of an impact than an article in The Atlantic or Everyday Feminism. Seriously, it's not rocket science. But let's see how the moving of goalposts occurs in this article, because this is fun. Quote, new informed consent laws and the Congressional Heartbeat Bill follow the same logic that the silent scream did. Their sponsors act as if ultrasound images prove that a fetus is equivalent to a baby and that pregnant women only have to be shown ultrasound images in order to draw the same conclusion. But the heartbeat made visible via ultrasound does not actually demonstrate any decisive change of state in the cell mass that might become a fetus. Diane Horvath-Cosper, an OB-GYN who works for Physicians for Reproductive Health in Baltimore and Washington, D.C., points out that as a benchmark, the heartbeat is kind of arbitrary. 2 days before, we couldn't see the activity, Cosper says, but the cells were there and they already had that contractile activity. What the appearance of the flicker on the ultrasound shows is not a change of state, but a threshold of the imaging technology. Alright, so now we're no longer talking about whether ultrasound images are objectively showing what's going on in the uterus. We're not debating whether they're 100% accurate or not, and because they're not 100% accurate, we're somehow supposed to conclude that they are 100% inaccurate? Really, leftists? Really? That's how low you want to go? Remember, these are the same people who poke fun at creationists because creationists point out missing links in evolution and use those to conclude that evolution as a whole is bollocks. The same rationale, however, does apply to you lefties. Just because the ultrasound detects the heartbeat 2 or 3 days after it actually occurs for the first time doesn't make it bollocks. It just makes it mildly inaccurate. So what? That still doesn't change the fact that it depicts an actual baby with an active heartbeat, doesn't it? Forget about the moral and legal issue. This is a scientific accuracy issue. You claim that things aren't so clear because it might take a few days extra in some cases to detect the heartbeat. From where I'm standing, those few days extra don't actually matter. It's there, it's a human, and it has a heartbeat. The fact that the imaging technology is imperfect doesn't change the reality of the phenomenon observed using the technology, doesn't it? It's like saying that watching the moon to observe a crater through the telescope is not really relevant because the imaging in the telescope is usually upside down and thus imperfect. Well, that may be so, but the crater observed is still there, isn't it? 3 more paragraphs. In July 2015, the Centers for Disease Control released a report indicating that women were having abortions at far lower rates than they had in the 80s and 90s. Charmaine Yost, the former president of Americans United for Life, credited ultrasound with the drop. There's an entire generation of women who saw a sonogram as their first baby picture, Yost told the Associated Press. There's an increased awareness of the humanity of the baby before it is born. But there is no evidence that pregnant women react to ultrasound images in the way that Yost suggested. Indeed, the evidence suggests the opposite. Well, does it? Economists have argued that the falling abortion rates, now at their lowest level since 1971, track the failing birth rate in general. Research shows that different women react differently to ultrasound images depending on their attitudes towards their pregnancy. While older mothers and women who have struggled to conceive often express great joy, women who do not desire a child often remain indifferent. A 2014 study published by the journal Obstetrics and Gynecology, which drew on the medical records of nearly 16,000 women seeking abortions, found that viewing an ultrasound had a negligible impact on whether they decided to proceed. Alright, first of all, Someone who is not a literature major should edit the articles at The Atlantic. When I wanted to click on that study, I got an email menu. The only way to retrieve the link is if you know how to view the source. Secondly, the argument put forth by the economists does indeed make sense, but only insofar as abortions following a relatively similar trajectory to pregnancies. Of course, less pregnancies means fewer abortions, but is it a straight line? And the citations offered by The Atlantic, which again you can only retrieve if you view the HTML source because the article is poorly edited. Anyway, their citation simply doesn't say that. It says that the fall in teen pregnancy rate is likely the most responsible factor to fewer pregnancies in the first place and consequently fewer abortions. So the correlation is not really that rigid as this author tries to suggest. Also, the studies of nearly 16,000 women seeking abortions is actually 15,168 as per page 3 of the studies cited. This is one of those little lies that the media puts there to overstate its case. It wouldn't have hurt its case at all had they said a bit over 15,000 instead of nearly 16,000. It's just basic rules of approximation. But anyway, the study does indeed show that the effect of viewing ultrasound images lowers the likelihood of abortion by 0.6% overall in the study. But it also shows that it has a statistically significant effect on women seeking abortion with a medium or low decision certainty. Among that group, the effect is 4.8%, and that, in science, is called statistically significant. Secondly, that study is quite far from representative. 49.8% of the test group was Hispanic. Now that's far from representative of the general society. Whites comprised only 17.1% of the test group. Thirdly, the control groups were quite lopsided. Almost 70% of whites did not see the sonograms, while only 30-something% did. Meanwhile, 55% of blacks in the study did see the sonograms and 45% did not. Overall, 60+% of the instances studied did not see the sonograms. And I could go on like this forever. The point I'm trying to make is that citing that study doesn't exactly help this author's case. In fact, it severely undermines it because its results aren't representative and thus can't be extrapolated whilst maintaining some sort of intellectual rigor and honesty. Also, it shows that the author doesn't even try to understand the pro-life mentality. This is another issue with leftists. They simply don't understand those who disagree with them. Even some leftist professors are starting to notice that the cocooning of leftists in leftist enclaves is dangerous even for leftists. The same, however, is not true with rightists. I mean, most rightists do understand leftists. Even the most uninformed, dumb rightist still does understand the left a lot more than your average New York Times or The Atlantic columnist. So, as I was saying, this author fails to understand the pro-life mentality. From a pro-life standpoint, the 4.5% effect of sonograms is a victory per se, because the goal of pro-lifers isn't to be mean to women, but to save as many lives as possible. You don't have to agree with that, but as long as you can't even understand the motivation, citing mostly irrelevant studies and citing them poorly at that isn't forwarding the discussion. The same goes with the last paragraph. Quote, "These findings are not surprising." Well, they're not, but they're also irrelevant. After all, nearly 60% of abortions are obtained by women who already have at least one child. Not exactly true either, but we don't have time to debunk that one too. Those women know what pregnancy means. For them, informed consent laws add insult to inconvenience, slowing down their access to care while belittling their ability to make decisions about their own bodies. But pregnant women aren't the only audience for forced ultrasounds. Like many other uses of this technology across history, the Heartbeat Protection Act enlarged the fetus in the public eye while edging women out of the picture. Well, yes, they do seek to enlarge the fetus in the public eye whilst edging women out of the picture. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, from a pro-life perspective, women are adults and can take care of themselves fairly well, whereas the fetus, which pro-lifers see as a child, cannot defend itself and thus needs extra protections from the wider society. Now, whether you agree with that view or not is a different story, but if you seek a discussion, highlighting irrelevant toss isn't helping anyone. The fact that informed consent laws adds insult to inconvenience isn't relevant at all. It shouldn't be incredibly convenient to get an abortion, and there was a time when liberals used to agree with this. Anyway, the reason I included this one in this episode is because abortion debates are seriously back on the table and will be for the foreseeable months, so I thought I would argue with some new arguments, and this is true for both camps, really. The right has pretty much dropped most of the bloody shredded into pieces imagery and scaled down the extreme militants. But the left hasn't. The left continues to argue like it's the 1980s and there's an anti-abortion terrorist behind every bush. And that is not healthy. Also, the left has become a lot more radical since the 80s. Safe, legal, and rare has morphed into safe, legal, often, and bought and paid for by the taxpayers, whether the taxpayers want it or not. That is not normal. That's an absolutely insane position to take. The honest pro-choicers out there do need some introspection on this, because this insanity cannot go on and will not go on. The fastest path to create more pro-lifers is to pull stunts like these. Anyway, we've been going on for quite some time, so... Oh, shit. Yeah, okay. I'll stop here. Stay tuned, another video on practical politics is coming up, and also a few other goodies are in the bag for this end of the month, March. Also soon, probably within a week, I'll start the fundraiser for this summer tour of Republic of Georgia and Armenia. Stay tuned for all of those as I'll lay out the travel plans. And with all of that being said, thank you again for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support, and I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.